Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special milestone here on The Right Take. I am Eric Lendrum with my co-host Jacob Grandstaff, and this is episode number 50. Thank you guys so much for sticking with us all this time. It has been over a year now, almost a year and 1 month now since our very first episode, and we've got two very, very big topics, of course, to talk about for today. Two of the biggest news stories right now, at least for the week, until something else inevitably comes up. But for right now, foreign affairs and one very big domestic story that we have not covered in the last couple episodes, even though these stories, or one of them, broke a few weeks ago. We are now coming around to it to finally give you the right take. It involves Russia and Ukraine and a brand new vacancy on the Supreme Court. But before we do that, I just had to tell a little personal story here that, of course, relates to a very relevant topic, something that we have referred to many times here on The Right Take, and that is January 6th. And big tech censorship colliding together to affect none other than your humble co-host here. A little bit of backstory here. Way back on January 6th of this year, the one-year anniversary of that glorious quasi-revolution day we had, I posted an update in a Facebook group that I'm in about one particular January 6th prisoner who was in that Facebook group. A lot of us were kind of mutual friends with this guy on Facebook, who is now in prison. He was arrested in March of 2021, and he is being held in prison. He has been held in prison all this time. And I posted an update noting that he actually was making really, really good progress on his fundraiser. I posted a link to the fundraiser for Mr. Zach Rel, that's R-E-H-L, simply noting that he was over 90% of the way to his fundraising goal, roughly $42,000 out of $45,000. I posted this back on January 6th of this month. Then, on January 26th, 20 days later, I get a notification from Facebook letting me know that my account is blocked for 7 days. Now, of course, this has happened before. You know, I have posted some memes that are a little bit too edgy, from time to time, mostly in private groups. And I've been banned for anywhere from 7 days to 30 days, temporarily several times. But what was this one for? This 7-day ban was because of that update I posted on the January 6th prisoner, Zach Rel. It simply said, this goes against community guidelines. And of course, if there's one thing Facebook loves when it comes to banning people, it's ambiguity. They didn't say which community guideline was violated. They just said, violates community guidelines. They deleted the post, and you can't post, you can't comment, you can't react to anything, you can't send friend requests, you can't do anything for 7 days. So, of course, the best thing I can do to counter that is I'm going to further promote this guy's fundraiser, and I'm going to read the full description here. This is from the fundraiser, which is at defendzach.com. That's defendzach.com. Links will be in the description, and I'm just going to read through the summary here. On March 17th, 2021, Zach Rel was arrested by the federal government and is being grossly overcharged with crimes related to the Capitol protests on January 6, 2021. He had been granted pretrial release by a Philadelphia magistrate judge in March, but ordered a stay because the government wanted a Washington, D.C. judge to rule over his release. Yeah, because obviously a D.C. judge is going to be completely unbiased and impartial. At his hearing in June, he was denied bail even though the judge said that he did favor release. Zach is nonviolent, and the prosecution has said as much. He did not assault any police officers. He did not push through any barricades. He did not break into the Capitol, and he did not damage any property. This is all from the court hearing. This is admitted by the prosecution. So he wasn't even in the building. He was one of the protesters who was outside and guilty of being in the vicinity. So that's what makes this even more absurd, that this is definitely one of those more bizarre cases of, it's not really bizarre, we know what they're doing, but this is one of those more unjust cases where the guy is perfectly innocent, peaceful. He's not one of the ones who walked into the Senate chamber wearing a horn helmet, but they have still arrested him anyway. It goes on to say, he has a motion to reopen his release, but it had not been ruled on as of November 2021. For context, this fundraiser was created in June of 2021. The prosecution has filed a motion to have him transferred to Washington, D.C. from Philadelphia for no reason other than to punish him while he awaits his trial, which holds a tentative date of May 18th, 2022. And again, he was arrested in March of 2021. So they were going to hold him for well over a year. Again, that's in a couple months now, but at the time, he was looking at over a year of being incarcerated. A date that is well over the speedy trial time. This is true. His rights are being greatly infringed upon, and he is being treated as guilty before having even seen his day in court. Even when he does go to trial, the likelihood of having an impartial jury is unlikely. Yeah, of course, if he goes to trial in D.C., I mean, if there's one thing that's even more completely unbiased with regards to January 6th than the judges, since his arrest, Zach has missed the birth of his daughter with his wife, and while he is able to receive visitation from his wife and infant daughter, he has never been able to hold his child. He also has a teenage daughter that he has not seen since his arrest. Zach was the provider for his household, and his absence has been a cause of great stress, both emotionally and financially, on his family. And of course, he did miss that teenage daughter's most recent birthday as a result. It ends with, Zach is a father, a husband, and a Marine Corps veteran. All funds go toward paying legal fees and helping his family during this hard time. Again, that is defendzach.com. I will post a link in the description of that below, and I encourage everybody to donate. He is, at this time, a little bit more money has been donated since the last update I posted, $41,880, which is 93.07% of the way to his $45,000 goal, which is very impressive. You know, it's hard to find a lot of January 6th prisoner funds that are that close to their goal. So absolutely go support this guy. Be sure to go support other January 6th prisoners as well. There are so many more that need your support, and there's a great hub website for all of them, or at least the most comprehensive one that you will find, and it's patriotfreedomproject.com. patriotfreedomproject.com. There's multiple links for you to connect with a January 6th prisoner. There's merchandise. There's ways that you can support all of them. There's a very comprehensive list of all the prisoners who have fundraisers set up for them, including Zach and others. We've got to support these people because obviously big tech does not want anyone to know that a lot of these fundraisers are doing as well as they are. So we should support them at all costs and say, screw Zuckerberg, screw Dorsey, or not Dorsey, the Indian guy who's taken over Twitter. Screw all these people. We're going to support these people no matter what.
Well, the very idea that you would keep people in jail for a year waiting on trial is just absurd. That goes completely against our Constitution. Like the idea that it's the idea that you get arrested for something, you have a speedy trial, and it's resolved. Not you sit in jail for 15 months, 18 months. And if the thing is, if these people, a lot of these people were sentenced for what they did, typically the ones who have been sentenced are sentenced for like 6 weeks. So even if there's ruled time served, they've already served 5 times, however long they would have been sentenced to jail for. So. And also, it's not just that. It's the abuse that they're facing in these jails from people who aren't even Americans. Like these are the foreigners. Prison guards. The prison guards are foreigners. And the woman who runs the prison, she was called on Twitter saying that every jail should have a MAGA wing. Like these people literally hate the people who stormed the Capitol, even the ones who just walked around outside the Capitol. Anyone they could get their hands on. Like the article, the fundraiser says, they just want to transfer them to D.C. just to punish them. Basically, just for being Trump supporters. That's they don't need a reason.
That's all it's about.
It reminds me. I mean, WTOP is 103.5 FM. It's a local radio station in the Washington D.C. area. It's nothing but weather, news, and traffic. And every single day, over and over again, they have an update about the January 6th prisoners, and an update about how many were charged, what new developments there are, what new subpoenas there are, what the update is on Donald Trump potentially testifying or going to prison.
Right,
and it's almost a sadistic orgy that this radio station goes through. And you can tell. I mean, obviously their listeners like it in the D.C. area, but it is like a sadistic orgy, almost like in go back to Roman times. You got an enemy that has been captured. You take their warriors and you throw them in the arena and the Colosseum, and the Romans just go crazy watching the lions tear them to shreds. This is the way of many of the bureaucratic and professional elites around D.C. view Republicans, and this is just an opportunity really to just satisfy their sadistic, really animalistic type desires to see Republicans humiliated publicly like this.
Yep. It's disgusting, and we've got to continue to stand against it, no matter how much they try to censor us. And again, donate to these guys if you can. That's the most important thing. They can't stop. These are websites where they can't stop you from donating. Give, Send, Go, Patriot Freedom Project, and others. They will connect you to fundraisers where you can donate directly to them, and PayPal and Venmo won't be able to stop you. So now, the first of 2 big moments for this episode you have all been waiting for, the story that has been dominating headlines for almost a month now at this point, and that is the latest massive foreign policy blunder by the Biden administration, or what's gearing up to be that at least. We still, of course, are not fully over the ramifications of the collapse of Afghanistan and how Biden botched that in literally every way he possibly could have. And what we said at the time, while we were, of course, we're against interventionism and we don't want any more wars, we also don't want to look weak either. And you better believe that when that happened in Afghanistan in August last year, the whole world took notice, and especially those who have their agendas set elsewhere, namely Russia and China. And the China-Taiwan thing is another topic altogether, but with Russia, it's looking to be, Ukraine 2.0 here. We all remember, of course, when Russia took the Crimean Peninsula back in 2014 when Obama was president. And now they are looking to potentially, at least according to news coverage, they could very well be going in to finish the job and take over the entire country of Ukraine. They have had a buildup of well over, I think, 130,000 troops along their border with Ukraine. There have been evacuations of Americans at the embassy in Ukraine, as well as the evacuation of Russians from the embassy here in the United States. And it just seems to be getting worse and worse. Apparently, Biden had a phone call with the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, that by all accounts did not go well for Biden. And what is there to unpack about all this? What is the right take on this situation? Is this about to be Cold War II? Is this potentially World War III, another war in Europe? What's going on here? So, Jacob, let's break down, what does all of this mean?
Well, when you asked me earlier what my take is on this, how I see this, I said, well, I obviously side with Russia in this dispute. I mean, to me, it's a pretty clear-cut case of a country that simply wants to protect its sphere of influence. I mean, Russia's an old country. It goes back to really pre-Christianity, back to the early. I mean, Kiev and Rus started forming. I believe my history is a little shady. It might be it was 6th or 7th century A.D., and it's been an empire for going back to the 1500s. So we're not talking about a country like Albania or even Italy. I mean, this is a country that goes back, has been a large country, an expansive country going back centuries. So we are essentially expecting this large country that used to have an empire to simply sit back and say, yes, NATO, you can expand to every single country that borders our country, and we won't lift a finger to stop you. We won't protest. You just go ahead and swallow up Belarus. Go ahead and swallow up. You've already swallowed up all the Baltic states and most of the Balkan states. Swallow up Ukraine. Go ahead and admit Georgia and all these other countries that border us. Go ahead and take Mongolia while you're at it. Like, oh, sure, why not? Go ahead and take all these countries that neighbor us. It's almost like we expect our elite, our unelected bureaucratic elite in Washington, D.C.,
right,
the permanent foreign policy class, they expect Putin and the Russian people to simply sit idly by while NATO swallows up every single state that used to belong to the Soviet Union. That's simply not realistic. And you've got to imagine, what if the NATO countries, imagine we had lost the Cold War but had not lost our country, and the Warsaw Pact started expanding to North America, and South America started swallowing up Central America, and then was threatening to swallow up Mexico. I mean, obviously, we would say, no, you're not coming past Honduras. Like, you're not going to take Mexico. We're not going to allow Mexico to join your alliance. And it's not just a matter of them joining Team NATO. I mean, we've got a missile defense system set up in Romania. So the thing is, once we swallow these countries up into NATO, into this alliance that really has no purpose of existing past the Cold War. I mean, what is the purpose of NATO at this point? The Warsaw Pact is destroyed. The Soviet Union is destroyed. NATO does not serve American interests at all. We don't need these NATO allies to protect our country against anyone. And so when NATO swallows these countries up, obviously they put missile defense systems in these countries. They're going to move missiles into these countries right up next to Russia. So here's the thing. Like, during the 90s, we were on fairly good terms with Russia. Just to give a brief history, we were on fairly good terms with Russia. But because NATO continued to expand, that is what precipitated the rise of Putin. That is what precipitated the rise of Russian nationalism and the Russian defensive posture we were seeing toward NATO and toward the United States. Because it's only natural that obviously they don't want NATO to come right up to their doorstep. Now, with the current situation in Ukraine, Russia has not invaded Ukrainian space since 2014, which was 8 years ago. I mean, that's
it feels like a lifetime ago at this point.
Yeah, it was a very long time ago when they took Crimea. Crimea is 65% Russian, 15% Ukrainian. They voted overwhelmingly to join Russia after the overthrow of the government in Kiev. So that's not going to change. Like, Russia has already fortified their border in Crimea with the Ukraine. Crimea is never going back to the Ukraine, regardless of what their president demands. It's not going to happen. So that border is pretty much established. Crimea is going back to Russia. And by the way, for those who aren't aware of why it became part of Ukraine, in 1954, the Soviet Union simply decided out of hand that it was going to give Crimea to the Ukraine. Crimea had always belonged to Russia. It's always been a Russian. It was a mixture of Russian, Tatar-speaking peoples. And they basically said, okay, because it's right here on the coast of Ukraine, we're just going to give it to Ukraine. They didn't ask the people if they wanted to join Ukraine. They simply said, the Soviets said, okay, this is what you're going to do. In 1991, they held a referendum to still be part of Ukraine, but to remain independent. And Ukraine abolished that independence. There was almost like a parliament in Crimea shortly before Russia annexed the province. So Crimea is a done deal. So anytime you hear people claiming that, well, Russia needs to give back Crimea, it's a done deal simply because the people of Crimea don't want to go back to the Ukraine. So arguments that, well, Russia is invading Ukraine, they've already invaded Ukraine. They haven't touched Ukraine since 2014, since the Crimea. Another argument you'll hear when people take the side of Russia on this issue, on the border dispute, is they'll say, well, I'm not siding with Putin. They'll preface it with, well, Putin is a thug and a killer, but I'm not taking the side of Putin. But let's look at some of the
they
accusations.
say that they support the Russian people, right, rather than they say they support Putin.
No. I'm talking about when people take Putin's side on this issue. They'll say, well, Putin is a thug. I'm not taking up for Putin, but here's why I agree with his position. But, you often hear if someone's going to accuse a leader of being a thug and a killer, Eric, do you think it's reasonable that they ought to be able to present at least 3 reasons why a person is a dictator? If you're going to accuse someone of being a dictator, you ought to be able to present at least 3 reasons why they're a dictator.
Well, I would say certainly just because in this environment we're in, especially with the rise of right-wing populist leaders, not even talking about Putin, but in general, you have a prime example is Bolsonaro in Brazil, who a lot of people, he is compared to Trump, and a lot of people say, oh, he's a thug, he's a dictator. They say about all these, right-wing populist leaders who have arisen since Trump, Boris Johnson and others. But so you definitely want to ask them to be able to provide examples so that we can differentiate, because there are real dictators of the world today, obviously, still to this day. But and I guess the debate of whether or not Putin falls in that category is what you're getting at here.
So I asked Quartz. I went to Quartz to find out what exactly Putin is being accused of. So he's accused of murdering his political enemies, of imprisoning dissenters, of occupying foreign territory, and of quashing opposition. Oh, and also abetting some of the world's worst bloodshed. So it lists several people suspected of murders that were murdered on the orders of Vladimir Putin. But of course, we also have a list of people that people have accused the Clintons of murder. We don't have any evidence of that, but it's accusations. Again, like obviously Putin's going to deny this. His supporters are going to deny this. They're going to say it's all made up. But
is it too late to say that I believe that maybe the Clintons do have a higher body count than Putin does?
Well, again, like it's all speculation.
It's all speculation. Yeah,
you can believe what you want. But this is what, according to Quartz, the list of people suspected murdered on orders from the Russian leader or people close to him is long. It includes several Putin's early critics, among them liberal politician Boris Nemtsov, investigative journalist Anna Polikovskaya, and exiled former Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko. Okay, so
let's hope we don't go to war with Russia, because then we'd have to learn how to pronounce all their names correctly.
Yeah. Let's please don't do this. I don't want to hear. I mean, American journalists butcher Americans' names enough. So these are people like journalists and people that Putin allegedly killed. But again, like every country, you've got people. Okay, they report on something, their car blows up, stuff like that. Like that, you have a Seth Rich incident. They happen to get murdered and robbed, but the robber forgets to grab their wallet. Stuff like this happens all the time. So,
Seth Rich is a blast from the past, by the way. That was like conspiracy theories before conspiracy theories devolved into the QAnon stuff, like just the absolutely absurd.
So when asked about Putin's record of killings on a TV show, Donald Trump answered, quote, "Well, I think that our country does plenty of killing too. I've always felt fine about Putin. He's a strong leader. He's a powerful leader." One of my favorite Donald Trump quotes of all time. Okay, so another thing that Quartz accuses him of is imprisoning dissenters. According to a list from Russian human rights group Memorial, there are now 100. This is 2016. Now, this is an old article, so I'm sure they've added a couple of hundred more people that Putin has allegedly imprisoned. So there were, at that point, 102 people held in Russian prisons for their political beliefs. Hey, 102 people. There's been more people than that in America held for their political beliefs just in the past year.
Because of January 6th.
Well, yeah, that and other reasons as well. I mean, we see Americans the American government the American regime, if you will, cracking down on right-wing dissenters all the time.
Parents who protest at school board meetings are being called terrorists.
That reminds me, in Colorado Springs.
That's the thing we hate to admit is that, we can criticize Putin all we want and, discuss whether or not these instances are legitimate or not. But the fact of the matter is that to act like America, the government, and again, I want to differentiate when it's okay to criticize things America is doing when it comes to the actions the government is taking, because obviously we don't support our government. We don't support the elite that rules over us anymore, whether it's the elite that drone striked a bunch of children in the aftermath of the Kabul bombing, as retaliation that didn't work out so well, or if it's the same government that, says, let's have the FBI classify conservative parents who are against mask mandates as domestic terrorists. There's absolutely this democratic backsliding going on here in the United States right now, whether we want to admit it or not.
Yeah, and you mentioned school board parents. There was this lady in Colorado Springs. She was very vocal at her local school board. The FBI showed up to her home. They busted open her door. Her kids were upstairs. One of the FBI agents grabbed her daughter and dragged her upstairs by the hair. They ransacked her home, And then she asked for a warrant. They didn't present a warrant. She said, "What are you here for?" They said, "Well, you were. We have reason to believe that you were committing some type of cyber fraud or whatever." She had no idea what they were talking about, and they left. They never came back. They never presented a warrant. And they never came back. So you have instances of intimidation by the FBI like that in the United States, and I'm sure whatever I don't know which the FSB I think is the modern incarnation of the KGB, of the Russian KGB. I'm sure they do the same thing to Putin's opponents as well. I mean, yeah, there's nobody's perfect in this regard. Another accusation is that Russia has occupied foreign territory. We've already covered that with the Crimea. Mm-hmm. Another accusation is the quashing opposition, and this is the Alexander Navalny. This is the thing with him.
The journalist who got poisoned, right?
Alexei Navalny. No, he's in jail. He was he was accused of some type of fraud or embezzlement. And look, we see that with General Flynn. I mean, there's plenty of instances where you've got an opponent, and obviously the instance with Hillary Clinton. She obviously what she did deserved about a year in prison.
You're talking about the private emails.
The private emails, yes.
Well,
if she was sentenced for that, she would have spent a year in prison. And look, if Donald Trump wanted to, he could have had his Department of Justice pursue that. She would have gone to prison, and it would probably be in the same situation as Navalny. Like most people who are politically connected in any country have committed probably at least 5 to 10 crimes during their time in office.
That's what happened with Paul Manafort too. They went after him for Russian collusion, like the rest of them, and then when it turns out there was no Russian collusion, they got him on financial fraud of some kind that he did actually commit. Yeah, but it was beside the point.
This happens in every country. You've got politicians and political insiders in every country who commit crimes all the time. They're petty crimes. Many times they're simply minor tax evasion. The problem is they don't get caught until their political opponents manage to get a hold of the justice system. And this is normal. It's just par for the course. Another one is obviously abetting some of the world's worst bloodshed, and that's talking about Bashar al-Assad. That's a topic for another day, but one that, once again, I'm on the opposite side of the American government. I don't believe that it's the United States' job to go around trying to slay demons and spread democracy, and that was the whole impetus behind the let's go remove Bashar al-Assad.
Well, especially because after what we saw happen in Iraq and Afghanistan, and certainly with Libya as well. Libya was kind of the original pretext for that. Was the original predecessor to the Syria ordeal, because of course when they toppled Gaddafi, it created this massive refugee crisis, and you saw these refugees flooding across the Mediterranean, heading straight into Europe. And you can imagine Syria being even closer to Europe than Libya was. If Assad were to fall and ISIS were to sweep in and fill that vacuum, which was very likely at the time back when towards the end of Obama's presidency, you would see an even worse refugee crisis flood into Europe, and Europe probably would have never recovered at that point. So just for the sake of stability, again, the Machiavellian model that, would you rather have, a leader who is feared or a leader who is loved? It's better to have a leader who is feared, because then he's going to guarantee stability. It's better to have someone who is stable, even if they're kind of insane and or slightly evil, because, for the sake of regional stability. And that was the big flaw with removing Saddam Hussein. Yeah, Saddam Hussein was a dictator who absolutely oppressed his own people, but you know what? He was the one power in the region that was keeping Iran in check for the longest time. Those two neighboring countries balanced each other out. So as soon as you took out Saddam and you have a permanently weakened Iraq, now Iran is free to basically pull a North Korea at the least and flex their muscles a lot more and create more headaches in the region than there were before Saddam was overthrown. But yeah, to the broader point, I definitely want to take some time here to disagree with some of the things you have just said, Jacob, because, first, you came right out and said you support Putin. You side with Putin on this one. I'm going to disagree. This may sound a little bit like kind of the safe take. I really just don't think we should take either side in this. I'm not going to go out of my way to support Putin, nor am I going to go out of my way to support Ukraine. For no other reason, certainly, we don't need another war. The last thing we need is another war after we just got out of the longest war in our history. And I think that's Putin's biggest strength here, is he knows that we, the United States, as a democracy ruled by the people, allegedly, don't want another war. And he knows that for that reason, Biden is not going to send any troops in the event of an invasion, which is why it really is a lose-lose for Biden. He stands by, does nothing, and on the United States' watch, quote unquote, as we are the world power or the world police, another country gets taken over. But if he goes in, we have another war, and war is just not popular anymore. War has not been popular probably since the presidency of the first Bush. I get what you're saying with regards to Russia wants to protect its sphere of influence. And I get, of course, as we've said many times in this podcast, there's a lot of things that lots of metrics are used to judge our world today in politics and in culture through a Cold War lens that is obviously very, very outdated by a number of decades. That we should still not continue treating things as if it's just us versus the Soviet Union. Russia has its problems. Russia has whatever it's got going on. We should not treat them like they are the one other nation competing to be the world hegemon at this point, because they're not. They are a fragment of what they used to be. They're not the Soviet Union anymore. Russia's economy has shrunk significantly, but I I would not go so far as to support Putin, if for nothing else too. Don't we generally support borders here on the Right Take? I think that is generally a right take to have. We support national sovereignty. We don't think countries should have their borders taken over unless they are a rogue state that did it first. Again, like Iraq invading Kuwait. Then, of course, we go in and we beat them back just enough to say, stop, no more of that, stop it. So I think in the event that war happens at this point, that Russia does invade Ukraine, we should just not do anything, which again is not the best. It's not ideal because you are still going to see another war and a lot of civilians die. But as far as I'm concerned, it's just not our fight. It's not our battle anymore. Because like you said, yeah, Ukraine is not in NATO. Therefore, we have no obligation to defend them. If this was a NATO ally, then yes, it would still be. Obviously, that would not be ideal either because we don't want another war, but we are contractually obligated to defend our NATO allies. Ukraine's not a NATO ally, so as far as I'm concerned, that's the end of the story right there.
Nothing you said is disagreeing with me.
I simply said that in the sense that I wouldn't take Putin's side.
No, you are taking Putin's side by not insisting that that Ukraine join NATO. That is taking Putin's side.
In the sense that I would rather nobody gets invaded here. I would rather there be no more wars. I mean, that's just, call me idealistic. I would rather there not be another war. Again, we just got out of another one. There's always going to be skirmishes in like the Congo or stuff like that, but it would be nice to just have an era with no wars, especially because right now if there is any semblance of a Cold War right now, it's the one between us and China. But even then, again, that's a topic for another day.
Okay, well, let's look at what America's position on this is, because I've already kind of laid out what Putin's position is, what Russia's position is. So what is what is America trying to accomplish in this? So normally the Republican Democratic parties, they don't agree on anything. You can't get 53 senators to vote on anything. Typically, you're really lucky if you can get 51 senators to vote on anything, and especially when you've got a completely divided Senate like this. But one thing they are completely united on is the foreign policy establishment's view of America's role in the world. And for instance, on CNN State of the Union, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey, he made a joint appearance with the panel's top Republican, Senator Jim Risch of Idaho, and Menendez said that there was, quote, an incredibly strong bipartisan resolve to have severe consequences for Russia if it invades Ukraine, and in some cases for what it has already done, obviously referring to helping the separatists, taking over Crimea, I guess amassing troops within Russia's border on its own territory. And he said that legislation was currently under discussion and was expected to include, quote, massive sanctions against the most significant Russian banks, crippling their economy meaningful in terms of consequences to the average Russian and their accounts and pensions. Let me repeat that. So Menendez said that there's currently a bill under discussion for sanctions against the most significant Russian banks, crippling to their economy, meaningful in terms of consequences to the average Russian and their accounts and pensions. In other words, Menendez isn't saying we've already got some more sanctions in the works and we're going to hit their oligarchs. We're going to hit Putin's bank account. We're going to hit the country's ability to wage cyber warfare. No. What he's talking about is attacking the poor Russian peasant who has absolutely nothing and taking his pension away from him. That's the kind of attack that he's talking about sanction-wise. What's more is Senator Risch, he's of course right there with him. He chimed in and he criticized Tucker Carlson's, of course, Tucker Carlson, as most people know who follow news, he has pretty much taken Russia's side on this issue. He does not believe that the United States should get involved in this issue, should not try to push Putin or, try to pull Ukraine over into NATO and provoke an attack by Russia. So this is from the Daily Beast. It says Senator Risch, quote, while criticizing Fox News star Tucker Carlson for questioning why the United States should support Ukraine amid increasing tensions with Russia, Senator James Risch said on Sunday that, quote, we always side with countries that are democracies. Now, think about that for a second. So if there's a conflict anywhere in the world, one country meets our definition of a democracy. I mean, what exactly is a democracy?
That's a good question.
Is the United States a democracy? Like after the election of, I won't even say it, but after certain elections, is the United States a democracy? That's kind of an open question. And what exactly, is Russia a democracy? I mean, they have elections. Putin wins every time.
Yeah.
What about Ukraine? I mean, Ukraine elected someone, and then with the help of Soros's organizations in the Ukraine and our State Department, we overthrew that duly elected president and installed somebody that our side believes should be president. Now, obviously, both sides claim there was electoral fraud. Both sides claim the other is illegitimate. But can you really say that the Ukraine is a legitimate democracy? I mean, what is a legitimate democracy and what isn't legitimate democracy? See, let's take Germany, for instance. The alternative, Alternative for Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany, that's their far right-wing party, they won a state election a couple of years ago. Merkel left her diplomatic tour in South Africa, went straight back to Germany, and they invalidated the elections. They basically told the people, no, you can't elect them. So, democracy varies.
Sounds kind of familiar, especially for Germans.
Yeah, so basically democracy is whatever the Western elite want democracy to mean, and it means that you're only allowed to – basically they want a system where they give you a slate of candidates, and then they say these are the candidates that the peasants are allowed to vote for, and if the peasants decide they don't like these candidates, well, that's tough luck. If you elect someone else, we'll simply have that person overthrown. We'll get our paid actors in the streets to overthrow them, and we'll install whoever we want. So – Senator Risch is basically telling the people he's advocating for Wilsonian foreign policy, and this guy's a Republican. Let's take the Heritage Foundation's take. They believe that we should that Biden made a mistake by unilaterally capitulating on Nord Stream 2. That's the natural gas pipeline. They believe that he made a mistake by sending a steady stream of envoys to Moscow to discuss this issue. I guess we're not supposed to send diplomats out anymore. We're just we're not supposed to talk to the Russians. And the Heritage Foundation writes, quote, "These high-level discussions are a mistake. Putin's list of demands for discussion are so outlandish they cannot possibly be met." Now, is that true? Let's look at what exactly are Putin's demands. I'll tell you what Putin's demands are, Eric, and you tell me if the average Republican voter would consider this to be reasonable. So here's what Putin is demanding. Here's his written list of demands. He wants two things. Number one, he wants assurances that Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. His second demand is that the United States and NATO withdraw all of its nuclear weapons from former Soviet republics and nations that once belonged to the Warsaw Pact.
So Eastern Europe, basically.
Eastern Europe. Basically, he wants assurances that Ukraine will not join NATO, and he wants all of NATO's weapons withdrawn out of Eastern Europe away from his borders. Do you think that the average Republican voter, if you went to the average Republican voter and said, do you think these demands are reasonable? Do you think the average Republican voter would agree that those two demands are reasonable?
From the context that most Republican voters, again, they certainly now, thanks to Trump, most Republican voters are in the anti-war category and don't want another war, and would take a look at that and think, oh, if that's what it takes to avoid a war, because on top of avoiding war, it's also I'm not sure what the term is, de-arming, denuclearization of Eastern Europe, they probably would support it. And again, as we said, from the context of, moving on from the Cold War lens of the world, then yeah, absolutely, that I could see why some people would think that makes sense, yes.
Well, see, this is the problem. Like, nobody ever asks the average voter what they think about this. They're basically told what to think. And this goes back to what we talked about with the Truman Doctrine. And during the Truman Doctrine, it pretty much bamboozled the American people into believing that it was in our national interest to spread democracy and to make sure that the world was safe for democracy. It basically took Wilson's foreign policy and translated it into a post-World War II world. So in the instance of Ukraine, let's kind of dive in and figure out what exactly the United States seems to want. So Vox is that is basically the West Coast surfer dude's neoliberal rag that he goes to if he wants to find out what the neoliberal establishment wants him to believe and what it wants him to think. So according to Vox, Ukraine, it's talking about how Putin is claiming that the Ukrainians and Russians are one people and they ought to be united and joined together and stuff like that. They write, quote, "Ukraine has long been distinct from Russia," experts told Vox, and Putin's current mythologizing of the Russian-Ukraine relationship fits a pattern of falsehoods designed to reconstitute imperial glory and, more importantly, to shield Putin from the threat of democracy in former Soviet republics and possibly in Russia itself. So according to Vox, Putin is simply trying to shield himself and Russia from the threat of democracy. And not only the threat of democracy to Russia, but the threat of democracy to its former satellites. Now, knowing the political leanings of Vox, do you think that when Vox uses the word democracy, it's using it in the same sense that an American conservative would understand it?
Oh, of course not.
So let's notice the unique wording here. The threat of democracy in former Soviet republics and possibly in Russia itself. Democracy isn't really a threat. I mean, you could argue that democracy would be a threat to Putin because if you have actual democratic elections, he might lose the election. But how is democracy a threat to neighbors? I mean, it's not really a threat to Putin if a neighboring country has democratic elections. But let's check out these Vox headlines on democracy in the U.S. to see if their definition of democracy is actually what we think of when we think of democracy. So here's some headlines. The voting rights push in Congress is over. The fight for democracy isn't. I thought we already had a democracy in America. Protecting voting rights isn't enough to save democracy. American democracy is tottering. It's not clear Americans care. Democracy is losing. Build Back Better is the latest victim of America's anti-democratic Senate. 11 ways to fix America's fundamentally broken democracy. The 2018 election is a referendum on American democracy. So it's very obvious that Vox does not see the kind of government we have in the United States as being an actual democracy.
That's the phrase they love to throw about, again, especially after January 6th. Our democracy, our democracy, our democracy. They almost universally, the leftists, the mainstream media, and the Democrats keep using that phrase, and they're saying our democracy, clearly referring to their side of the aisle, not our as a collective nation. And again, you got to ask yourself, whose democracy is it they're really talking about there?
But going back to what they said about Putin's current mythologizing, because obviously Putin doesn't want war, Ukraine doesn't want war. They really don't want. Putin basically wants NATO to back off. Ukraine would like to be part of NATO because they're scared of Putin. That's understandable. But according to Vox, Putin's current mythologizing about the so-called brotherhood of Ukrainians and Russians is to try to shield himself and the former Soviet republics from democracy. Now, we need to kind of figure out what Vox means by democracy, because they obviously don't mean democracy like we think of democracy. And if they're wanting to impose that kind of democracy, whatever they mean, on Russia, then if I were Putin, I wouldn't want that imposed on me either. I wouldn't want that imposed on any neighboring countries. Okay, so let's look at the neoliberal history of democracy spreading. First of all, you had Soros in Eastern Europe, who basically went in and set up foundations, flooded it with hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, these foundations had so much money, they were more powerful than the governments themselves. And then you had all the color revolutions, where you had foreign-funded, Soros-funded revolutionaries getting in the streets and overthrowing democratically elected governments and installing new regimes. So obviously, if I'm Putin, I'm definitely going to try to avoid that situation. So what would happen? What exactly does the United States want? Let's say if the Biden regime got everything it wanted, what would that look like? If the writers at Vox got everything they wanted regarding Ukraine and Russia, what would that look like? Obviously, let's take the basics. Ukraine would join NATO. The United States and NATO would put anti-missile defense systems in Ukraine. They would load Ukraine down with weapons. They would load Ukraine down with NATO troops and American bases right up on the border with Russia. And then they would start doing to Russia what they've been doing to all these other countries. Think about, where did the color revolutions take place? The color revolutions took place in Kyrgyzstan, in Georgia. They took place in Kazakhstan. In these countries that all border, they took place in the Ukraine. They took place in all these countries that border Russia. Well, if you can get all those countries to join NATO, now you've got Russia surrounded. Where's the next color revolution going to be aimed at? It's obviously going to be aimed at Moscow. They're going to start supporting color revolutions in Moscow. They're going to start trying to strangle Russia's economy. Then you're going to have separatist movements. And you're going to have article after article appearing in the Western press talking about all the persecuted minorities in Russia who simply want to be free from Russian domination. You're going to start having separatist movements to try to break Russia apart so American capitalists can move in and swallow up whatever is left.
So basically some elements of kind of what's happening to America right now.
Yes, they basically want to take what big tech and what American corporations have done to American democracy, and they want to do that to the Russian government and the Russian people. So if you're looking at this from a Russian's perspective, forget about whether or not you like Putin or not. If you're a Russian and you're looking at what's happened in the United States, so you've basically got a choice. Okay, I can put up with a Russian strongman who's a bit of an asshole, or I can put up with Jeff Bezos. I can put up with
who is not elected, whose power. Jeff Bezos is more powerful than Vladimir Putin.
Yes,
obviously.
Exactly. I can put up with Bezos. I can put up with any number. I can put up with Zuckerberg coming in and being like a quasi dictator in my country, because that's what would happen if all these countries join NATO and then you spark color revolutions in Russia. You get Russia to be split apart. What's going to happen is you're going to have multinational corporations move in and basically move in like vultures and eat up what's left.
And they will be, and the most important thing, they will be unaccountable to the people, because you don't vote for corporations. You don't vote for CEOs of the big tech companies, and they know that.
Yes, exactly. So looking at this from an American's perspective, how should an American react to the situation in Ukraine and Russia? Well, first of all, and this is a problem with the Republican Party. It doesn't really have a foreign policy. Their whole shtick is basically Biden is weak. Biden is showing weakness. Biden is being a weak president and show weakness on the world stage. But when you think about what should their foreign policy be, if you want to have an America first foreign policy, it needs to be the kind of foreign policy that Trump had toward Russia and the Ukraine. He basically told Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, look, you and Putin, maybe y'all can sit down and figure this stuff out and discuss things. That's kind of what you want. You want to facilitate dialogue between Zelensky and Putin. You want to get Putin and Zelensky in the same room and say, okay, look, y'all sit down, figure this out. Ideal situation. Crimea remains part of Russia. Ukraine recognizes that, and Russia promises not to meddle anymore in Ukraine. and we won't swallow up Ukraine and NATO. And Ukraine recognizes they're not going to be part of NATO, and you just live happily ever after and just accept it. That's the way it's going to be. That's what would happen if the American government represented the American people and had an America First foreign policy. But of course, the American government doesn't represent the American people. The American people have no say in their foreign policy. They basically find out what the foreign policy is whenever they read the headlines that we've started a new war.
Yep, and then they just go along with it because the media is only going to report, one particular side of it.
And there's no political opposition. Like, the Republican Party is going along with this 100%. I even read a town hall article the other day, and below, this was on Russia and Ukraine, and below the article, it said, editor's note, town hall stands strongly with the people of Ukraine, and we need to send a message against Putin's interference in Ukrainian politics, send a message to Biden that he needs to be tough on Putin. I'm thinking, what's the difference? Basically, you've got two parties who have merged into one foreign policy establishment. And there's no pushback at all from the Republican Party in any of this.
And that was one of the main reasons why they pushed back so hard on Trump on that more than most other issues. Keep in mind, the idea of facilitating dialogue between two world leaders to avoid a conflict, that's crazy. Never forget that when Trump first ran, and in 2015 or early 2016, he was asked about Putin out on the campaign trail, and he said something like, why do we have to have a conflict with Putin? I would like to get along with Putin. I'd like to be able to talk to him. That was the moment when the media collectively went, talk to Putin? This guy must be a Russian plant or something. And that was the birth of the whole Russian collusion narrative out of that single moment, because Trump had the wild idea of, hey, how about we not go to war for the first time since Jimmy Carter? Which, again, Trump did that, by the way. Trump was the first president since Jimmy Carter to not get us into a new war.
And the same reaction they had toward Trump is the same reaction that the Heritage Foundation is having toward Biden. One of their complaints is that Biden sent emissaries to Moscow to negotiate. They don't believe that Biden should negotiate. Their idea of peace through strength is basically telling Putin, I guess this is kind of what's implied, don't invade Ukraine or we're going to attack you. We're not going to negotiate. This is not negotiable. So that's where we are. Both parties have the same ideology when it comes to foreign policy. They believe that the United States should be in the Wilsonian mold. It should be the world's policeman. It should go around and protect democracies and fight for democracy, not fight for Americans, but fight for the nebulous concept of democracy. And it's really disgusting. And it's something that if the thing is, if the America First movement is ever going to take over the Republican Party, they're going to have to tackle the foreign policy aspect, because you cannot have domestic policies that mirror the will of the people when you have a huge behemoth of foreign policy establishment that suffers losses like we suffered in Afghanistan and just keeps rolling like nothing happened.
Let's send another 8,000 troops to Ukraine after we just got out of a 20-year war. Yeah, no problem. Right back to business as usual. Because of course we have the former Raytheon executive as our new Secretary of Defense. I wanted to refer to one last point as well. You mentioned a while ago that, the people of Russia can choose at this point. They feel like they have to choose between a strongman like Putin or, faceless corporations or extremely obscenely powerful and obscenely wealthy trillionaires like, Jeff Bezos. It reminds me of something that's been talked about a while ago, some articles that were written saying that even European countries, that there's a broader international resistance now to the dominant export of the United States since Biden came to power, and that export is wokeism. And they say, and again, they're using it in the loose term that, we have debunked here on the Right Take, that it just encompasses all of leftism. But you've heard about this from European countries, including France even. Emmanuel Macron getting up in Biden's face and yelling at him at that one summit meeting a while back because he was sick and tired of, critical race theory and white privilege and this nonsense that was slowly starting to creep into French culture because, hey, it's happening here in America, it's going to happen elsewhere. So in that sense, you could argue, the Russian people who don't want, cultural Marxism in their country, it's a phenomenon that you are seeing elsewhere, even in so-called friendly nations like in Europe. And as if we needed one more reminder of what that wokeism, and real wokeism, by the way, the original definition of wokeism, as we talked about in the last episode, you need a real reminder of what that is. That is what leads us directly to the next big topic on this episode. The one other big story that is at this point has kind of swept Russia and Ukraine out of the spotlight for at least a little while longer. And you better believe that when Biden got this news, he was like, oh, thank God, a distraction from everything, from Russia, Ukraine, from the failure of, the voting rights bill that he shelved his entire agenda for, Build Back Better and otherwise. And that is, of course, a Supreme Court retirement. You got to know, this is my mindset, by the way, Jacob, that when I first saw this news break, I saw it on the TV the other day. For a moment, my eyes lit up. I'm like, here we go. And then I remembered that Trump's not president anymore. So I was thinking we're about to have a 7-2 court. No. So Justice Stephen Breyer, who was nominated by Bill Clinton to the Supreme Court, He is 83 years old. He is the oldest justice on the court in age and the second longest serving justice on the court now, only behind Clarence Thomas. He announced his retirement, or apparently the news of his retirement got leaked, and apparently the justice was not happy about that. He wanted to announce it on his own terms, but he's stepping down. So, because of course there were a lot of articles going around on left-wing publications of the internal pressure from Democratic leaders to convince him to step down now, while Democrats have control, quote unquote, again, a 50-50 tie with Kamala as the tiebreaker, control of the Senate. So they, with Biden, can confirm a new nominee to replace him for the next 30 to 40 years. So we are now looking at, because again, the moment I saw this, and I already knew, before I even remembered, I knew where this was going. Because this leads us back to 2020, of course, when Biden was on the campaign trail. And a little flashback here, the internal politics. Biden was way behind in 2020, of course, at the start of the primaries. In the Iowa caucuses, Pete Buttigieg ultimately emerged the winner, quote unquote, with the most delegates, even though Bernie won the popular vote. In that same caucus, Joe Biden came in 4th place. In New Hampshire, of course, he did even worse and came in 5th place, while Bernie ran away with ultimately a narrower victory, but a clear popular vote victory over Buttigieg. And then in the Nevada caucus, Bernie ran away with that contest, and Biden came in 2nd, a very distant 2nd. Bernie got 34% to Biden's 17.6% of the vote. So at that point, Biden was an afterthought. It was pretty much Bernie's nomination to lose, and Biden needed a Hail Mary at this point. And one individual in particular in the state of South Carolina, a certain member of House Democratic leadership. Jacob, do you remember this person? Jim Clyburn, the House Majority Whip. And pretty much the most prominent, I think, African-American member of either House of Congress at this point, House and Senate alike. He is a power player in Democratic politics. Biden, apparently behind the scenes, was pleading for this guy's endorsement to give him a fighting chance in South Carolina with its large black population to have any chance of stopping Bernie. And apparently, behind the scenes, prior to this rally, this campaign rally where Clyburn appeared on stage with Biden and announced his endorsement, which a lot of people saw as the turning of the tide that allowed Biden to win the nomination, from Bernie, Clyburn made Biden swear to him behind closed doors that he would go onto that campaign stage and pledge as president to nominate a black woman to the Supreme Court, the first black woman to serve on the Supreme Court, who would be the 3rd black justice overall after Thurgood Marshall and, of course, incumbent Justice Clarence Thomas. Biden, of course, made that pledge, and now here we are at the moment where he has to follow through on that. Breyer is retiring, and there's already a delightful shortlist of potential candidates for first black woman to serve on the Supreme Court. So, Jacob, what's the latest on this story?
Well, just to go through some of the top potential candidates, we got Ketanji Brown Jackson. She's currently on the D.C. Court of Appeals. She went to Harvard for undergrad, then Harvard Law. And, of course, she's purposely tried to up her resume by coming down harsh on all those insurrectionists
January 6th, that's right.
that tried to hang Mike Pence. I guess she cares so deeply for Mike Pence.
She learned a thing or two from Emmett Sullivan, I guess.
Yes, Emmett Sullivan is Emmett Sullivan. He's the guy that was over the Flynn trial. He's
the worst. Actual judicial tyranny is
that's
what that
the thing
is.
About whenever you get these partisans in, not just partisans, but specifically black partisans who have an axe to grind, not just with Republicans, but with white Republicans, because they genuinely believe that white Republicans are white supremacists. When you go before these judges, you can't expect justice because they've got their axe to grind against what they perceive to be your belief system. So this is the case with Ketanji Brown Jackson. So I don't think we need to guess how she would rule on affirmative action. Another one is California Supreme Court Justice Leandra Kruger, who went to Harvard, then Yale Law. Circuit Judge Candace Jackson Akiwumi, she went to Princeton, then Yale. Circuit Judge Eunice Lee, who went to Ohio State, then Yale. District Judge Wilhelmina Mimi Wright, who went to Yale, then Harvard Law. So all of these women are obviously very qualified. None of these, you can't really look at any of their resumes and say, okay, well, if they get on the bench, they weren't qualified. It's just because of their skin color. So, and this is one of the problems with my reaction. Well, this is one of my problems with the reaction that's come from the right, the Republican Party in particular.
It's both yes and no. Like, yes, on paper, they have the resumes from all the Ivy League schools. But at the same time, yeah, this is totally going to be an affirmative action pick. That's the point.
So, yeah, but whenever you're faced with like a Supreme Court situation, you've got dozens of people who are qualified. And that's like the short list that Donald Trump released from the Federalist Society. Every single person on that list was qualified to potentially sit on the court. So in a situation like that, let's say if you want to pick a woman. So he wanted to pick a woman when he picked Amy Coney Barrett. So he's obviously going to look at the list of women. And he's going to pick the top one from the top candidate from that list of women. It's like, let's say, for instance, you're apartment hunting and you've got 3 neighborhoods and you want to live in one particular neighborhood. You're just going to pick all the apartments in the neighborhood. You can pick the top one in that neighborhood. It's the same way with picking a black woman. So it's not that the person isn't qualified. It's just that you're discriminating against people who don't fit the particular group that you want to set on the court. So here's a very good article that MSNBC put out on the Republican Party's hypocrisy and lack of honesty. You won't hear
a good article from MSNBC.
Yeah,
who knew?
You won't hear me say that too many times, but this one is particularly poignant in that I completely agree with its opinion. It is an opinion piece, but it's by Jarvis DeBerry.
I think that is legitimately. I'm actually been keeping track here, Jacob. That is the first time in almost exactly 1 year that MSNBC has had a good opinion. The last one was way back when we did our episode paying tribute to the late Rush Limbaugh shortly after he died, when MSNBC's Chris Hayes had that genuinely thoughtful tribute to Rush on Twitter, saying that he was one of the architects of modern American conservatism. So, yeah, the first good take MSNBC has had in 1 year. Congratulations, Peacock Network.
So DeBerry writes, President Joe Biden's promise to nominate a black woman to the Supreme Court seat being vacated by Justice Stephen Breyer is being pilloried by the right. But it's a refreshing departure from presidents who've made race-conscious nominations while asking the public to accept the lie that race never entered their minds. And this is one of the things that all the fetching you hear from Republicans about the fact that Biden is discriminating against non-blacks by not only picking a black woman. Well, this isn't the first time this has happened. Throughout American history, at least going back to the early 20th century, there has always been a conscious desire for presidents to balance the court with the makeup of the country. So when you had a half Protestant, half Catholic nation, there was a conscious effort to try to make sure that there was a balance between Protestants and Catholics. As the Jewish population grew in America, there was a conscious effort to make sure that you had at least one Jewish person on the court, preferably 2 Jewish people on the court. And as time went on, they continued to, after the Civil Rights Movement, they put Thurgood Marshall on the court because Lyndon B. Johnson put Thurgood Marshall on the court because black people now had complete access to the ballots, they should have one of their people on the court. And it's the same with women. Like Ronald Reagan wanted to be the first president to appoint a woman to the court.
Sandra Day O'Connor.
And the point that DeBerry is making here is that you had past presidents who obviously were being specific in the fact that they were going to put a particular race or particular gender on the court, but they just pretended like they weren't. Biden is just coming out and being honest about it. He promised, whenever he was campaigning, he was going to put a black woman on the court. Okay, Breyer decides he's going to retire. He promises to fulfill his promise of putting a black woman on the court. DeBerry writes, Biden's decision to openly talk about the race of his forthcoming nominees suggests that we may be past the quote-unquote colorblind nonsense that was all the rage a generation ago. You remember, don't you, the quote-unquote I don't see colored people who with that falsehood implied that blackness was something dirty and unmentionable or something the person thus afflicted had to overcome? When President George H.W. Bush announced in July 1991 that he'd picked Clarence Thomas to fill the Supreme Court seat left vacant by Thurgood Marshall, he suggested it was pure happenstance that he, a virulent opponent of quotas, was replacing the court's first and only black justice with another black man who would also be the only black person on the court. When he mentions that you had the colorblind generation, that was like Gen X, some boomers, but mostly Gen X, that claimed that they didn't see color, we were all one nation. But when you think about it, that he's actually right. If you are colorblind, you are essentially saying that you want to erase black people off the face of the earth or off the face of the nation. Because if you're colorblind, what color do you see? Like, do you just see black people as white people with dark skin? Are they no different than white people? They just basically have a different skin pigmentation. And the point that DeBerry is making is that if you do have a colorblind society, you have to erase black people from the body politic. You have to completely erase black people from American history, from American culture, from American society. Because if we're all one people, then black people obviously don't exist.
Like, forget about, he basically says, this is the mindset that says, forget slavery. Slavery didn't happen. None of this happened.
Not just slavery. I mean, you think about it. If we're all going to be colorblind, that means that black music doesn't exist. You just have American music. If we're going to be colorblind, that means that the black dialect and the black accent doesn't exist. We just all speak with an American accent. Some just have different American accents from others. If you want to be colorblind, that means that black history doesn't exist.
Black History Month, which we're about to enter right now, by the way.
But I mean, you think about it, that means everyone's just one. We all have the common American history, and black people don't have anything separate that is their own. And this is something that colorblind white people can't seem to comprehend. And most of these so-called colorblind white people, they tend to come from areas with not many black people. And they're good people and they mean well, but they're not thinking through the ramifications of what they're thinking about, of what they intend to do. So if you want a colorblind society, you essentially are saying that you want to erase the memory of black people from the country. And that's obviously something that black people don't want. And this is why there's such a huge gap between all the woke nonsense and the Republican Party, because the Republican Party sees this and they're like, well, what are you doing? This is completely against what Martin Luther King Jr. wanted. But they are looking at Martin Luther King Jr. through their lily white eyes, trying to interpret what Martin Luther King Jr. was saying to make them feel good. And look,
I saw that.
The reality is we are not like Englishmen. So you take a black Englishman and a white Englishman, they are the same ethnicity. The only difference between them is their skin color. They speak with the same accent. They have the same history. They have the same heroes. There's literally no difference. They have the same culture. They eat the same foods. There's no difference between them other than their skin color. That is not the case in America. Black people in America have their own separate culture. They have their own separate music. They have their own separate dialect, and they have their own separate interpretation and take on history. And if you're going to try to create a colorblind society, you are demanding that you deny them all of that. And this is what the Republican Party continues to try to do. And this is why there's such a big disconnect between them and black people.
Well, no, because I kind of see, I'll push back on that a little bit, just because we saw this in, certainly, I think in the 70s and 80s it was referred to, and even a little bit in the 90s, was known as the era of good feelings, the immediate post-civil rights era where everybody did kind of get along. No one really did care so much about race as much. But it certainly is seeing a new resurgence of this kind of neo-segregationism among younger people. I saw this in college. When I went to college, I'll always tell this story. Overwhelmingly, the students I saw, they're not just the black students, but students in general, whenever asked about MLK, they always said, oh, he was weak. He was a loser. Obviously, I'm using more polite language there. They all think he was basically trying to appease the white man. They prefer Malcolm X, who supported segregation, by the way. And that's why you see this push for, in colleges, race-based segregated housing again. They're trying to basically kind of revert back to square one. So it's different concerns, quote unquote, a different political outlook of a new generation that obviously is much further removed from what happened decades ago.
But how much of that outlook of that woke backlash is a backlash against the colorblind push by Generation X? Because again, if you're going to be a colorblind society, that means you have to erase black people from the American picture. And so you have young black people. They're like, well, wait a minute, I don't want to just be an American. I have my own separate ethnicity and culture. And if you want me to just be like you, you just want me to be white with dark skin? I don't want to do that. Like I'm different from you. I have my own separate culture and history and dialect and what have you. And so this is the issue that Republicans are facing when they see Biden, who is a realist on race. Like Biden is a complete realist on race. He does see color. Like he has never pretended to be colorblind. And
his policies have certainly shown that he is focused on this race-based stuff. Again, reparations for non-white farmers.
Exactly.
He gave a new African-American holiday, Juneteenth, which I always say, National Independence Day. Are you kidding me? Like things like that. And again, this push to federalize our elections, which is really just a push by the BLM lobby to basically give them, a small radical minority power over the entire country.
Now, obviously, there's a minority of black people who would like to assimilate into the broader white culture, and they look at what Biden is doing and they're appalled by it, and they see this as just taking them backwards. But the reality is the voting patterns bear it out that the overwhelming majority of black people agree with this. And the one thing that I can't stand about Republicans is Republicans take the same view toward blacks that elite white liberals take toward rural whites. Elite white liberals believe that they know best for rural whites and that rural whites are voting against their own best interests. This is what you hear among white liberals all the time, that rural white people keep voting against their own best interests. This is what you hear from Republican elites all the time, that black people continue to vote against their own interests. So, and this is what you see, that they believe that the Democratic Party, this is the mythology, that the Democratic Party is so racist, they have convinced the majority of an ethnicity to vote against its own interests. So what is the majority of that ethnicity? So dumb, so illiterate, so incapable of independent thought that they're led astray by racist white Democrats.
It's definitely worth looking at because you look at, for example, in 2020, I mean, there was a greater push for the African American vote to vote for Republicans. You saw it with Candace Owens and the Brexit movement and Trump and a variety, the lowest unemployment rate for every group of Americans in modern history. And especially the most infamous gaffe, arguably, is when Biden was on that show, The Breakfast Club, with Charlemagne the God. He famously said, if you got a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black. And of course, there was a lot of backlash over that, both within the black community and broader, from Republicans and whatnot. And yet at the end of it all, the race riots and everything all said and done, I think he got 87% of the black vote. Not Obama numbers, but still ridiculously high for a guy who basically, you would think, taking a look at a comment like that, he basically did say, "Oh yeah, I think black people are stupid if they don't vote for me." That's basically what he said, and yet he still got almost 90% of them to vote for him.
Well, it's because he's realistic about the racial situation in America. He doesn't try to gloss over it. He recognizes it for what it is. And like with Jim Clyburn, he comes to him. He wants Jim Clyburn's endorsement. Jim Clyburn's like, "Okay, well, you want my endorsement? I want to see a black woman on the Supreme Court." And Biden said, "Okay, sure." I mean, that's politics. It's horse trading, And this is one thing that you're dealing with. Most black people, they don't care as much about the black unemployment rate as they care about representation. Most of them would prefer to see a black woman on the Supreme Court rather than see their ethnicity's unemployment rate drop by another 2 or 3 percentage points. That's not as important to them as seeing one of their own in the highest court in the land, especially someone who agrees with them as opposed to Clarence Thomas. So
that's the thing on The View the other day. Like, they were discussing the Supreme Court vacancy, and one of the women, one of the white, it wasn't Whoopi Goldberg, it was one of the white women who said, like, we already have we have one black justice on the Supreme Court, only one out of, all the other justices are white. And Whoopi Goldberg then chimed in and said, and he doesn't really represent the black community, and of course,
yeah.
Of course, like Whoopi Goldberg, probably one of the wealthiest African Americans in the country, has any idea, what the broader black community is thinking about, but I digress.
Well, no, I think she actually is more in tune. She's far more in tune with what the broader black community is than Clarence Thomas is, because again, you go back to the voting patterns. Most black people would agree more with Whoopi Goldberg than they would with Clarence Thomas. Obviously, the 10 to 15% of blacks who would prefer to just assimilate, like the Frederick Douglass types. Like Frederick Douglass was hoping that one day the only difference between black Americans and white Americans would be their skin color. Like in Brazil. In Brazil, there is no black ethnicity. In Brazil, you're just Brazilian. You got brown, black, tan Brazilians, people of different amounts of African ancestry, and everyone speaks the same dialect. There is no black dialect. There is no black culture. Everything is just all mishmashed together. They've influenced each other's culture, and it's just all wrapped up into a new Brazilian culture.
Yep.
That was kind of what Frederick Douglass wanted, but it was unrealistic because at that time, the black ethnicity was already fully formed. Like, it wasn't like it was in the progress. It had already been fully formed.
Because it was kept separate from every other aspect of American culture, because slaves were very much kept in their own little world to form their own cultures and their own music and whatnot.
Exactly, yeah. So that was simply and now you do have, again, 10 to 15% that would like to assimilate. They agree with Frederick Douglass. They see Clarence Thomas as a hero. Okay, great, good for them. I'm very happy for them. I wish more black people would join their camp. That's just not realistic, and Joe Biden recognizes that. And one last point on this, on DeBerry's article, he points out that George H.W. Bush did the same thing. No one in their right mind believes that George H.W. Bush picked Clarence Thomas by accident. He was replacing Thurgood Marshall, for crying out loud. Obviously, we're not dumb. We don't have to. And the argument they'll make, and this is something that Jonathan Turley, he's a law professor, he's a conservative law professor at George Washington University. He makes, it's kind of ridiculous. Listen to this argument. He tries to argue that Reagan didn't specifically put Sandra Day O'Connor on the court because he was being sexist against men or because he specifically wanted a woman. He makes the argument, we're going to link to this in the description, that Reagan wanted a woman, but he was open to anybody. And he makes the argument that George H.W. Bush, he didn't necessarily pick Clarence Thomas because he was black. He just basically picked him by accident because he was the best candidate. Nobody believes that. And it's just like with Trump. And the argument he makes even with Trump, it's the most absurd thing imaginable.
With Amy Coney Barrett?
With Amy Coney Barrett.
Replacing RBG, of course.
Even though Trump specifically said he was going to put a woman on the court, the argument he makes that Jonathan Turley tries to make is that because Trump had this list of the Federal Society candidates that he wasn't exclusively limiting himself to women. But again, if you're looking for an apartment in a new city and you've got 3 neighborhoods and you like one neighborhood more than the others and you want an apartment in that neighborhood, even if you looked at 20 apartments in the other 2 neighborhoods, you're going to pick the apartments in that one neighborhood and you're going to pick the best option. And it's not that it doesn't mean that that apartment you picked isn't good or as good as the other options. It's not that. It's not like Sandra Day O'Connor was unqualified. It means that she was the most qualified woman on the list. It doesn't mean that Amy Coney Barrett was unqualified. It means she was the most qualified woman on the list. Again, any of these black women that Biden is considering, they've all got Ivy League degrees. They've all been on, they've all been judges. They're all well qualified to sit on the court. Obviously, ideologically, we would prefer that they stay as far away from the court as possible. They don't believe in original, strict construction and all that stuff, because obviously they're going to let their ethnicity influence their views on the Constitution. But as far as qualifications, resume, they're completely qualified. They're as qualified as anybody. So again, like the outrage by Republicans over this issue to me is very, very silly, very, very hypocritical. Trump did it. George H.W. Bush did it. Ronald Reagan did it. It's just something that you do. You try to balance it with Protestants, Catholics, Jews, atheists, whoever you can, to try to make sure the court represents the makeup of the population. So
it's also something that we all saw this coming a mile away. Like the moment, again, even forgetting about Biden's campaign pledge, the moment I saw the news, you knew that it was coming. So to act surprised that is the path he's going. I also just want to say on a side note with Clarence Thomas, because we got to acknowledge Clarence Thomas is the best justice on the Supreme Court.
Oh yeah, hands down.
He is pretty much some people have called he's the shadow chief justice, because they have a clear 6-3 minority or 6-3 majority, and they don't need Roberts anymore. Like the upcoming Roe versus Wade ruling, they could overturn it without Roberts. So people would argue he's really the chief justice, or at least the ideological leader of the Supreme Court at this point. And his nomination, you could argue, him being chosen as an African American worked because obviously, succeeding Thurgood Marshall, but it also gave him a much stronger chance of being confirmed. Because what people forget is that when he was confirmed, Bush Sr. was president, the Democrats had a majority of 57 seats in the Senate. Republicans had 43. So in today's environment, obviously, it doesn't care if he, it's a black transgender woman, genderqueer, nominated by a Republican. Democrats had that majority, they would have shot him down, shot him, her, they, them down, because it's so partisan nowadays. But that identity politics playing into it, also combined with Thomas's genuinely great speech. He famously, when the allegations came out against him, it was kind of the original Kavanaugh, the allegations came out against him, he held nothing back and described the allegations of fake, obviously, as this is a high-tech lynching against uppity blacks, who will not conform to a certain system, in this case, to the Democrats' agenda. And again, Joe Biden was at the time chairman of the Judiciary Committee, so he was front and center of all that. And that ultimately, a lot of these things all came together to show a lot of these things ultimately came together so that he was confirmed with 41 Republican votes and 11 Democrat votes for a narrow margin of 52 to 48. Again, if Bush had nominated just some white guy, he probably easily would have been rejected by the Senate at that point.
Well, just in closing, one thing that's really infuriating about Republicans, this is from the Federalist, this is an article by Joy Pullman. She writes that Biden's pledge to nominate a black woman for SCOTUS is racist and sexist. And the argument she basically uses isn't that it's racist against white people, which it is. It's not sexist against males, which it is. She's basically arguing it's racist against black people and it's sexist against women, because apparently whoever is picked will always have an asterisk by their name because they were picked because of their identity rather than their qualifications. And again, it's just all of these people are going to be qualified for the court. Like you've got there's probably 100 people out there that are sitting on courts that are qualified to sit on the Supreme Court. But it's just this idea that this colorblind push, this gender blind push that the Republican Party has adopted wholesale since really the 90s, that just doesn't make any sense, and it's not realistic. And that's why they continue to lag behind on race. That's why the Democrats continue to pound them on the issue of race, because they don't understand it, and they refuse to understand it. They refuse to take it head on and just accept it for what it is, rather than try to live in this fantasy America, this fantasy colorblind America that never existed. And so that's that. I wish Republicans, if conservatives would pay more attention to what these potential Supreme Court justices have said, what the opinions they've written, their ideology, they could probably pull Joe Manchin over, maybe even Kristen Sinema.
Maybe even Sinema, that's right.
To get them to oppose their appointment, and eventually Biden would probably have to just scrap the whole idea of picking a black woman, pick somebody else. But instead, they're spinning their wheels, arguing that Biden is being basically being racist based on the law of low expectations and that type of thing toward black people. Which that argument just doesn't win black people over. They just basically laugh at that. That's just hilarious to them that Republicans think that this is somehow racist against blacks because it's going to somehow make this. I guess it's going to put an asterisk by this woman's name forever, and she's always going to feel less than because she was picked because of her gender and race, which. I don't think Amy Coney Barrett loses any sleep over the fact that she was picked because she was the most qualified woman.
Exactly. And again, it's going to be interesting to watch to see the internal dynamics of the Senate to see if there is some, backroom deals being negotiated that we may be able to pull the Manchin over, because Manchin already screwed over Build Back Better, and he and Sinema together have screwed over the voting rights bill. So I wouldn't put it past one of them to possibly make our day even more. Wouldn't that not be the funniest thing ever to see one of them screw over Biden's latest agenda item? And can you imagine? He'd probably have a heart attack at that point to think one more thing these people have ruined for him. But we'll see. We'll see. Again, I'm not going to hold my breath. And again, the great thing about this is Breyer is a liberal justice, so this doesn't change the makeup of the court at all. We're still at least another 10 years, I think, give or take with Thomas's age. We have the majority for a good while longer. Alito as well. So nothing horrible will come out of this that will change the course of the future of the country. All the major nominations were already filled under Trump, thankfully. But it is interesting, nevertheless, to see, again, Biden doubling down, doing what little he can to distract from all his other failures and to try to consolidate what little support he has left. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for this episode, this special episode, again, episode number 50 of The Right Take. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. As always, be sure to follow all of our latest content on our website, righttakepodcast.com. The full list of podcast platforms and social media sites, alt tech platforms where we are available, righttakepodcast.com/subscribe. And if you are feeling ever so generous, righttakepodcast.com/support. We'll talk to you next week, guys.